If you recall, last time we talked about some of the tools of argumentation, the basic tools of philosophy, and argument was one of them. We looked at definitions. We looked at the necessary and sufficient conditions for defining certain terms. That's essential, as we'll see, with Socrates. And I think I had you, in fact, try and come up with the necessary and sufficient conditions for something to count as knowledge. If you were to define knowledge, what are the necessary and sufficient conditions? I'm going to talk about that today with Plato. But we left off last time talking about some of the issues that people like Socrates and Plato were dealing with, namely relativism and skepticism. In particular, they were responding to, there's a sweater, if anyone needs it, or is missing it, 60% cotton, 20% rayon, and 20% nylon, if that matters. It's not, but it's a nice percent. I don't know. And then 30% unknown fibers. So, if we look at what some of the people around the time before Socrates were writing, those are his dates, we see a difference. If I'm a sophist, did you see that in the text? What's the definition of a sophist? I don't think I gave that to you yet, but if you had you know that word yet? What's a sophist?
I don't know the exact definition, but trained to speak in a convincing fashion.
That's right. Really good at oratory, at rhetoric. And the term sophist has a negative connotation because of people like Plato and Socrates. It's a negative. You take a class in speech, I don't think they call it rhetoric anymore, but you're taking a class basically in that, in a positive sense. Public oratory is simply public speaking, which is hard to do. You've got to get used to doing it. People fear it. I'm told people fear public speaking more than death in the United States. I don't know why that is. That's a real deal. It's a real thing. Jerry Seinfeld has a great joke about that. You prefer to be the guy in the casket than the guy giving the eulogy. You see, he sets it up better than that. But a sophist is someone who is trained and, importantly, trains other people for a lot of money how to win arguments. Literally, the sophist means, if you ask somebody, what are you? Oh, I'm a philosopher. Immediately, you have looks like, oh, you're one of those arrogant people who thinks you know everything. Which is unfortunate, because that's not at all what philosophy is about. However, it kind of is what sophistry is about. If you ask a sophist, what are they? They are self-proclaimed, self-professed, wise people. There's no room to do anything here. There we go. So, a sophist is a wise person, but a philosopher is what?
Someone who studies wisdom.
Someone who studies it. What is the literal meaning of a philo? Lover of wisdom. You see the difference? Socrates calls himself this, although he's accused of being this. We'll say why in a moment. What is the difference between a lover of wisdom and one who's a wise person? Does the lover of wisdom presume to have wisdom? No. Not necessarily. It's a seeker of wisdom. That's a big difference than somebody who already claims to have wisdom. Socrates is responding, in many respects, to the sophists, who charged a lot of money, usually for young men who are going into the profession of politics, wealthy men, and taught them how to win arguments. The negative element of it was how to make a weaker argument appear stronger. That was what they were accused of. And Socrates and Plato and Aristotle, as we'll see, didn't like that. They didn't like the idea that you can make a lot of money teaching people how to win arguments, how to persuade. And notice there's a difference. Philosophers are less interested, according to an ideal interpretation, according to Socrates, they're less interested in winning arguments than they are in seeking wisdom. You may lose an argument, but have sought and acquired wisdom. You may persuade somebody and win the argument and yet lack wisdom. You may win the argument and still have a conclusion that's false. You may succeed in persuading the jury that your client is innocent and yet they're not. The sophists are less concerned with truth and more concerned with winning. It's all about winning. And if you can trick people, if you can use language, if you can use tricks of logic to fool people, to persuade people, and so long as you win, that's all that matters. Do you see the difference between sophistry and philosophy? So there are people like Protagoras, who's a famous sophist. He's famous for saying man is the measure of all things. Of things that they are, and things that are not, that they are not. By that he means what is true is dependent upon a given culture. And there are other sophists who go even further and say truth, what is morally right, for example, is dependent upon who has power, who has might. And in a way, the sophists are saying that generally. Whoever can win the argument has power. But what happens if the one who wins the argument lacks truth? What if they're wrong? What if they've defended successfully because of tricks, or they've manipulated the populace? What if they don't have the truth? What if they're unjust? Socrates has a significant problem with that, and that takes us into the question of how it is we could know this. So, Socrates is interesting, and there's a lot I'm going to skip through here. He's accused of being one of those philosophers who has his head in the clouds and is only concerned with unimportant things that don't relate to humanity. Like the original philosopher in ancient Greece, a guy named Thales, who purportedly was walking, looking up at the clouds, philosophizing about the heavens, and unbeknownst to him, because he's not paying attention to his surroundings, he falls into a well. And there's a village girl there laughing at him. And philosophers have gotten a bad rap ever since Thales fell into this well, which I don't even know if that ever really happened. It doesn't matter. That's the representation. This is an image from Aristophanes, who is a comedian, playwright. You know he's a comedian because he's got the word funny in his name, Aristophanes. That's my mnemonic device to help remember that. He wrote a play called The Clouds, in which Socrates is the main figure. Here he is being hoisted up in a basket so that he can study the clouds. The assumption is that he's unconcerned with real-world situations that affect humanity. Aristophanes was mistaken about that. Aristophanes' depiction of Socrates is a flawed one. It's a biased one. In fact, he accuses Socrates of being a sophist, of having a school. He called it the Thinkateria, right? Like a cafeteria, but it's where you can go and learn how to win arguments, and also learn how to make a weaker argument appear stronger. And also you can learn about the mundane, or rather the arcane notions of how clouds work, but also how fleas can jump, and how far they can jump, based upon whether or not they're farting. That was the study of presumably in Socrates' Thinkateria, according to Aristophanes. He's making fun of him. That never actually happened. That's a bit of nonsense. But he's trying to show that this is what philosophers like Socrates deal with. They assume that they're doing something impressive and important, when in reality they're dealing with flea farts, or something like that. That's actually in the discussion. So, this is a misrepresentation of Socrates. We have other interpretations of Socrates, of course, from Plato, but not just Plato, who has a positive view of Socrates, the historical figure, but historians like Xenophon. If you take the absurd rendering from Aristophanes, who made fun of Socrates, and in fact played a huge role, his plays did, in getting Socrates executed, as we'll see. You also have the biased interpretation from Plato, who's probably a much more accurate interpretation than Aristophanes, but it's tempered by a more middle-of-the-road approach from the historian Xenophanes. So you have a number of sources we can look at at Socrates. Even though he didn't write anything, he never wrote anything down, all we have of his ideas primarily come from Plato and his dialogues, like the dialogue you had for today. It came out of the Republic, which is one of his most well-known works inside and outside of philosophy. Take a political science class, you're probably going to read the Republic. You take maybe a class in psychology, you might even get some reading in that. It's an extremely versatile text, as we'll see. But the readings that we have from Plato give us an understanding of who Socrates was, even though he wrote nothing down, because he famously argued, Socrates did, that to write things down would be to make my thoughts like bastard children, because I would no longer be there to defend them. Once you've written it down, it's there. And everyone, no matter where they are in their education, is going to be reading the same words. Whereas if I'm speaking with you, it's a conversation, it's a dialogue, which is what Socrates thinks of philosophy. Well, then I'm going to temper the way I talk. I'm going to change the way I respond. It's going to be affected by the immediate conversation. Once it's written down, it's in stone, and it's a bastard child that I can no longer defend. He also had other problems with writing things down. He didn't like the idea of pen and paper as a technology taking the place of thinking. Once you've written it down, you don't have to think about it anymore. You can just refer back to it. And therefore, relinquishing the responsibility of the individual. There's a lot more that could be said about this. And you could imagine what he might think of Google. He would despise that technology. Google becomes an extension of your brain that you no longer, it seems, have to do much thinking. How do I get to this place? You can just Google it. It's awesome. And if you have it on your iPhone, it can just tell you how far away you are. What does this word mean? You can plug that in right away, get the answer. Some words. You can Google the word knowledge, and you may or may not get the right answer. Or you may or may not get the adequate answer. What is piety? What is justice? Those are concepts that Google may not yet be adequate to answer. Certainly not in a couple of sentences. These are the kinds of questions that Socrates is raising. That's the kinds of questions he's interested in. I'm going to skip through a bunch of this. Although it's notable that he's seen as the paragon of virtue and of wisdom historically, and especially through the eyes of his, I don't want to call him student, because Socrates didn't teach. He didn't have a school. He didn't charge anyone any money. People just followed him. He was like a rock star, and they would just follow him around, young people, as he would ask questions of the powerful and rich and presumed experts of Athens. And he would have a huge following, and they just watch him and get impressed by how he responds. I'll talk about that in a moment. But one of the reasons Socrates would just go around asking people in the open marketplace, the agora, which is where you get agoraphobia, fear of open places. This is an open marketplace, is because he wanted to refute this oracle, which the oracle of Delphi, there's a lot of the background here I can't get into, but it's kind of like reading your horoscope today, kind of. And this horoscope told him, this god told him, that he's the wisest of all of Athens. He immediately found that to be false and didn't believe it. And he spent much of his life, after learning of this, trying to disprove that by going around asking all of the wise people, again, self-proclaimed wise people often, about certain things that he himself did not know. What is piety? Or morality, if you want. What is morality? He wants to know that because he's being accused of impiety, as we're going to see. And one of the proclaimed experts and powerful men of Athens at the time was named Euthyphro, who was a priest who claimed to be an expert in all things having to do with morality or piety. And this is wonderful for Socrates, who happens to be in jail, in the courthouse waiting trial, and Euthyphro happens upon Socrates at the courthouse. This is very lucky happenstance, because Socrates, who claims to not know what piety is, and let's imagine he truly is not sure, now has the opportunity of asking an expert. And this is perfect for Socrates, who again is being accused of not abiding by the gods of the state. I'm going to skip through this. Let me get to these two things. I'll come back to those other points in a moment. Really, this is to introduce the Plato reading. There are two things that Socrates is accused of, and a lot of this comes out because of the bias presented already by Aristophanes' play and others, of Socrates acting in ways that are somewhat strange, that didn't meet with the expectations of those in power. And so he's accused of impiety, which is this: failing to adequately give credence or respect to the gods of the state. And there was no separation of church and state in ancient Athens, so this could be potentially a capital offense, as it turned out to be. And he was also accused of introducing strange divinities, which may be a legitimate critique, because apparently at the Oracle at Delphi, there's an argument made, I can't remember who originated it, that this area might have been the location of a natural gas leak, which could have led to a kind of intoxication of those who went there. So there may be a reason why people went to this oracle and had visions. It's because that they were basically on drugs. And Socrates would often talk about his daemons, or daimons, which spirits or something like that would inform him and help him make decisions. Sometimes he would refer to just reason, with a capital R, as a kind of deity. So to the extent that he introduced new deities, there may be something there, but really that's unlikely to be the case. Plus his last words were, "I owe a debt to the god of healing," Asclepius. That is one of the gods of the state, so clearly he did abide by the gods of the state. In any case, this is one of his accusations. And related to that, he's also accused of corrupting the youth, which is what sophists were accused of, because he seemingly taught them how to make weaker arguments appear stronger. He corrupted the youth in that those who followed him and listened to how he responded to people would then use his strategies to question authority, question parents, question those in power. And of course, those in power didn't like this. Who are these uppity brats who think they know better than us? Well, these are the students of Socrates who have learned how to think very, very clearly and critically. So those are the two accusations levied against Socrates. Why were they levied against him, corrupting the youth and denying the state? Again, he was known. He called himself a gadfly. I didn't mention that. And a gadfly is an annoying bug, so annoying that it annoys horses. It's a big fly. Socrates called himself that because he would annoy, he would pester, he would bother those in positions of power. He would unsettle the status quo. And this is something that Martin Luther King from letter from Birmingham jail references, and we'll return to this at the end of the semester, is that he sees we need more people like Socrates who are non-violent gadflies, in the sense that they would disrupt the status quo of society, but without requirement for bloodshed, for example. Bless you. And he also called himself, Socrates did, a midwife for the truth, which is a great phrase, and he takes the analogy very far, perhaps too far. As we're going to see, he doesn't give birth to truth for people he's talking with. What is a midwife? Somebody helps deliver. Right. So the truth is in you. This is to put it metaphorically, but kind of, in some ways literally when we get to Plato. The truth is inside you, and Socrates there, as a philosopher in his context, is simply helping you to deliver it. Right? Occasionally the truth is stillborn, but that's not his fault, right? He takes this analogy, I think in some cases, way too far. But he sees himself as a gadfly, but also a midwife for the truth. He's not someone who says, what is piety, what is morality, and then gives us the answer and tells us why we're wrong. Instead, he asks questions of people like Euthyphro. This is where we get the Socratic method from, by the way. He asks leading questions. And he's ironic. He speaks from more than one perspective, more than one level, so to speak. He knows more than Euthyphro about piety, and I think he knows more. But I think Socrates really, when he asks what is piety, skipping that, what is morality, he's asking this of somebody who claims to be an expert. But he really does want to know, because I think he doesn't know, Socrates, doesn't know for sure what piety is, what justice is. And here he is about to drink hemlock after he's been accused by his 501 of his peers in a trial in which, again, those two crimes levied against him. He's accused of those. He defends himself. And he defends himself very well. There's a whole dialogue from Plato called the Apology, which doesn't mean I'm sorry, it means a defense in Greek. And so the Apologia or Apology, Socrates defends himself, revealing the inconsistencies in his accuser's arguments, revealing the weaknesses in his arguments. But he was also a bit arrogant, and I think that upset enough of the jurors that they ended up convicting him in a way that he may not have been convicted if he was more nice. Because in the end, there's an option in ancient Greek courts where if you're found guilty, you can choose your punishment. You get to decide. And typically, if that's an option, you would decide to give your punishment that's, strong enough that the jury would say, yeah, that makes sense, it's just. Right? Like, I'll never teach philosophy again, or I'll banish myself from Athens. Those are two things that was suggested of him, instead of death. And he said, no, I choose death. I'm not going to stop doing philosophy. He was like 90 years old too, by the way, so that's relevant. It's not like he's 30, just starting. And he didn't want to leave Athens. He felt that he was committed to this, maybe even on a divine mission to engage in philosophy as he saw it. So he didn't stop. In fact, you can see him pictured here in Jacques-Louis David's The Death of Socrates. He's still philosophizing. He's still pointing up to the realm of the forms, as we'll see perhaps, or to the other world. Or he's saying, I'm number one, I don't know, one of those things. And everyone's crying around him. And he does kind of make for what now we would call politically incorrect statement. He says, stop weeping like women and children. Because he's dying. The hemlock slowly goes up the legs, apparently, and causes paralysis until it gets to the heart. But it's a slow process. And while it's happening, he continues to engage in philosophy. In fact, he says, stop crying. Don't you know that my body, the vessel is dying, but the vessel of the body is just a prison for the soul, the self, which continues on. In fact, the whole point of philosophy is to learn how to die, which is to say, to learn how to see, learn how to think, learn how to reason without the encumbrance of the body, because the body gets in the way. As we'll see with the allegory of the cave, why that's the case. So here he is, after being accused. He eventually takes it, and here's a funny meme, of course. He gets all political. Actually, he would be dead after the first drink. And I don't know, medicinally, I don't know if that's an accurate representation of how hemlock works. That's not really relevant to us. But this whole text that you have for the reading for today is a very short section from the Republic, which is a very large text dealing with almost all of the philosophical issues that we see throughout history. You see ethics, politics especially, metaphysics, epistemology, and so on. There's so many different areas that this text covers. And it's unclear what the focus is. When you look at the dialogue, it starts off with a discussion about what justice is, what makes for a just person. And Socrates has us imagine, well, it's hard to establish what a just person is. Let's imagine expanding the person to the size of a state and find out what justice is at the level of a state, of a republic. And there you get the name, and that's why it's taught predominantly in political philosophy classes, political science classes, but it's not obvious that that's the central point that Plato's making. The theory of knowledge point may be more fundamental, as we're going to see. All right, in any case, let me wrap this up here before we get to that reading. Socrates is the main character in almost all of Plato's dialogues. That's why I wanted to talk about him first. Didn't write anything down, didn't teach, didn't charge for teaching. And for our purposes, Plato and Socrates' ideas are the same. That's not accurate historically, but for the readings that we're dealing with, they probably have very similar views. Plato accepted what Socrates thought, and Socrates probably would have no trouble with the way that Plato wrote about him, probably. Typically, the history of Plato's dialogues, and that's all we have from him, we don't have his lecture notes, we just have his stories that have conversations, for the most part. And the first third, they're broken up into three parts of his historical writing. The first third of Plato's writings are sometimes referred to as the Socratic dialogues, roughly the first third. That's because Socrates is the central figure, and they almost all end with confusion, with doubt. The Euthyphro is an example. That's the name of a dialogue. It's oftentimes Plato's dialogues are named after one of the central figures. So there's the Parmenides, the Euthyphro, the Meno, and so forth. The Euthyphro is one that ends with confusion about what a particular concept means. What does piety mean, for example? And for our purposes, we would think of piety in terms of ethics or morality. We don't use piety too much anymore, but think of it in terms of what makes something moral. And we'll come back to that dialogue when we get to moral reasoning at the end. I just introduce it now because it's so relevant to who Socrates is. The second third of Plato's readings is pretty much where you get the Republic that's a melding of both Socrates' ideas and Plato's ideas. There's some discrepancies in what Socrates thought and what Plato thought. And then the final third is mostly, if not all, Plato's ideas. For our purposes, to avoid confusion, Plato and Socrates have similar enough ideas to consider them the same. And here is what's interesting. Remember, Socrates is on trial, and he's awaiting trial. There's a holiday that he has to sit in jail before the trial actually happens. So he's sitting there for a couple of days. During that holiday, Euthyphro, the self-proclaimed expert, a priest, expert in piety and morality, happens to see Socrates at the courthouse, and they engage in a conversation. Socrates says, "This is fantastic. This is fortuitous. I'm being charged of impiety against the state. You're an expert in what piety is. Tell me so I can better defend myself. Surely you know better than I do what piety is." And there's a little irony in that. Socrates is playing around, but I still think he doesn't quite know himself what are the necessary and sufficient conditions for piety. And he asks Euthyphro, what is it? What's the definition of piety? And Euthyphro starts with this. It's doing what I'm doing now, which is, it happened to be, Euthyphro is turning in his father for a crime. He's defining piety by one example. And there's a complex story as to what his father was guilty of, presumably murder. That's too much to get into now. And this surprises Socrates. You're turning your father in? And that's to count as a definition of justice, of morality, of piety? Not justice, piety. What's wrong with that as a definition? Why is that insufficient?
Too specific.
Why so? Too specific. Why is that?
If I turned in my father for doing a crime, that automatically makes me, by that definition, pious. What he's saying is, if you define it by that one definition of, oh, look what I'm doing now, I'm turning in my father.
Yeah.
That's not a sufficient definition to.
It seems to be missing something, yeah. It doesn't seem to be enough. And it seems to be backwards. Because we might ask, well, how do you know you're turning your father in for this crime is pious? I asked you for the definition of piety, says Socrates, not an example of piety. There's a difference between an example of something and the definition. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for something? Right? And so this conversation goes back and forth for a long time. And Socrates plays his Socratic role of meeting Euthyphro on his own terms. Socrates at no point tells us this is what piety is and you're wrong, Euthyphro. Instead, he asks leading questions and takes Euthyphro's own words and reveals to him there is an inconsistency in your own position. Surely you see that. And as a rational person, Euthyphro is committed to recognizing, yeah, I did contradict myself. Or this does lead me to a dilemma. In fact, there's a dilemma that comes out of that dialogue called the Euthyphro dilemma, which we'll return to with ethics. So Socrates doesn't give us the answer, but he certainly, in a lot of these dialogues, the dialogues end with confusion. And as we recall from the first day, why is that relevant to philosophy? The dialogue ends with confusion. It ends with doubt. Why is that a positive? Yeah?
It must have revealed something that you didn't know before, even if you didn't reach a final answer. They
Right.
learned about the inconsistencies, and you're closer to finding out what it is.
Right. You've learned something. And importantly, you've learned the limits of your knowledge. You've learned what you don't know. Whereas Euthyphro would have been worse off never having confronted Socrates, because Euthyphro presumed to know with certainty what piety was. Socrates simply asked him a few questions, and Euthyphro was turned around and ended up being a bit angry, but also, and those who were listening, if they were following Euthyphro and maybe had his same view of what piety was, for example, they too came to the conclusion, I thought I knew or was certain what piety was, or whatever the concept might be. Now I recognize there's a gap in my knowledge. And now the hope is that recognition of that gap will lead to curiosity, which will lead to an interest in discovering and filling in that gap and coming to know what piety is based on philosophical thinking. In other words, philosophy begins with doubt. It begins with tension. That was that quote we started with Will Durant, genuine philosophy begins with doubt. And so we see, even though the dialogue ends with confusion, that's the beginning point of philosophical thinking. There's a lot more in these slides, which I'm not going to get into. Actually, there's not much more than that. I thought there was more. I want to jump to the Plato dialogue, or Plato's dialogue, that has Socrates as a central figure in it. So keeping in mind all that we just sort of set up there, Plato and Socrates are both responding to an intellectual atmosphere in which the sophists were predominant and the concerns of relativism and skepticism were also dominant. That's where we ended last time. How is it that we can know anything? Knowledge seems to be impossible. How do we justify what we claim to know? And Plato gives us a hint with his pointing upward. There's a hint to an answer to that question, how it is that we could know. This is a detail of the famous painting from Raphael, the School of Athens. In the center, you've got Plato holding his Timaeus, an important text on the origins of the cosmos, and Aristotle with his Ethics, an important text with respect to how human beings in this world, in this physical world, can best interact with others. So you see Aristotle sort of holding his hand down, saying, "Oh, simmer down, Plato. Let's keep it in this real world." Whereas Plato's concerned with what? The realm of, anyone remember from Rauhat? The realm of, what is it? Astronomy? Yes, to an extent, but there's a technical term he uses.
Cosmos?
No. The realm of the forms. Did that come up in the reading? Maybe it did, maybe it didn't. I'll talk about that. So he's pointing upward to this, and we'll see why he's doing that. There he is, Plato, much more attractive than Socrates. That's easy to say. Socrates was a hideous goblin. Question?
In the photo you just were showing, does the head in the corner mean anything? Or like, is
Head in the corner.
on the right corner? Bottom right corner.
That guy?
Yeah.
That guy?
Yeah.
Oh, it's not a severed head. That's Diogenes? Yeah, that's Diogenes. He's sort of sitting on the floor. He's famous for being. We should show you that. It's actually quite nice. He's famous for being breaking conventions and taboo. And he's sort of just splayed out all over the floor. I think that's, let's see, would that be him? Yeah, there he is. Oh, come on. So there's, yeah, is that Diogenes? Diogenes. I don't know why it's escaping me. Maybe it'll even tell us. Nope, it doesn't. But Diogenes is a fantastic character. He's somebody who in a way, takes Socrates' idea about fighting the status quo to its logical extreme. He's famous for not giving a shit about anyone of power or importance. There's a story of Alexander the Great who happened upon Diogenes and asked him, and Diogenes was somewhat famous for his dismissal of convention. And Alexander the Great stood on his horse and asked, what is it that he could do for Diogenes? And Diogenes said, "You can move, you're blocking the sun." That's basically all he said, because Diogenes would sleep in a barrel. He would never work. He would barely wear clothes, and he would masturbate in public. Not in the way that Louis C.K. did. His was more justifiable. And he said something related to that. If only I could satisfy my stomach as I do by rubbing my belly, then I would do so as well. Related to his other thing that he did. So there he is. That's not a severed head, but the head of Diogenes. Fascinating character. All right, so where am I? There we are. Now, I have a little joke here. That's a footnote. History of philosophy. Some of you may know the quote, and I think Rauhat touches on this. 20th century philosopher Alfred North Whitehead referred to referred to the history of philosophy as nothing but a series of footnotes to Plato, which just means all the main questions that philosophers have ever asked are simply addendums added on to what Plato did. Plato addressed all the important questions, and we've just been adding to Plato, which is not true, but it's very close to true. I mean, he's a very impressive figure in philosophy.
What was his name? Diogenes?
Diogenes.
Diogenes. I think some philosophy teacher, like, at that time was like, oh, we can't talk about him. He masturbates.
Yes. Yeah. Because that's one of the taboos, obviously. He was practicing what he preached. He took his philosophy to the streets in a way that most people would not.
Maybe in 2,000 years we can talk about Louis C.K.
Yeah, I hope it doesn't take 2,000 years. We already talked about Louis C.K. at the beginning of the semester. And that'll come up again when we look at the philosophy of humor on the last day of class. So if you have questions about Louis C.K. or Diogenes or public masturbation, bring that up in the final class. All right, let's skip ahead here. So that's the academy today. That's where it is now. Plato's fantastic, very interesting in the way that he builds up the text, the Republic. And there's way too much to get into now, but in the Republic, he talks about how to educate the populace and who should be educated for what. And there's a whole class, or maybe caste is a better word, in the sense that you are presumably born into a particular field for all intents and purposes. They're called the guardian class, and they're meant to supply defense for the Republic and to maintain equality, so to speak, for everyone. And the guardians from which the rulers of the state are taken included women as well. So some could make the case that Plato had or could have been one of the first feminists, although he also said other things about women in that they could be used in common that seemed to be antithetical to feminist ideas, as you might imagine. So that's a complex matter. But let's skip that and get to the point of the reading today. In his academy, which is his school that he founded, and the academy is the precursor to the medieval university, which of course is the precursor to where you are right now. In the old days, they would walk around, right? So you can imagine walking around this area, simply going out in the tree. We actually could probably do that here, but teachers now are also tied to technology. I can't take my PowerPoints with me, so we can't walk around and teach like we used to. The peripatetics, as they were called, which literally means just to walk about. And they would just walk around in their togas, obviously, and talk. That's very different now than the university, in which we're all just seated in front of screens, which, as I say, we shouldn't be doing this. Of course, I'm doing it. And I don't know, it seems too hard to get 60 people to go outside and lecture. The lectures were smaller, so that's why I guess I could justify not taking us outside. And I know somebody's going to ask, can we have class outside? So I've already jumped on that answer. Yeah, it's too hard. In any case, the academy is sort of the precursor to the modern-day college and university. On the door, on the entrance of the college, of the university, of the academy, is this sentence, or something like this, touting the importance of mathematics. Why do you think mathematics is so important for someone like Plato, a rationalist, when it comes to knowledge? We're going to erase this stuff here because there's no room to do anything else. Why is mathematics so important with respect to Plato's understanding of knowledge?
It's based in logic.
It's based in logic? Right, that's true. Why is that relevant to the rationalists?
Rationalists are based in logic. They're not based on what they see. It's based on what they can think and what they can imagine. Right? It's not imagine, but reason out.
It's based on what kind of reasoning? What's the Latin phrase? A priori reasoning, exactly. So for instance, well, let's see. Okay, forget the circles. What about this? What do we, this is nice. With triangles, and that's even worse. What do we know about that triangle?
We know that triangles have 3 sides. We know, I'm kind of eyeballing this, but I know at least 2 of them appear to be of equal length. I don't know about the last one, but if I could take a look, I could say, let's say they're all equal length.
They're not.
Yeah.
You eyeballed it incorrectly, which is part of Plato's point, but I'll continue though. There's more you could say.
Yeah, because I was saying because I know at least 2 of them are equal. But so we're assuming that let's say we know that triangles. Let's say that they know it's got 3 angles. They gotta add up to 180 degrees.
Is that true of this one?
It's true of every triangle.
How do you know that?
Um,
Everyone? Wait a minute. How many triangles have you seen?
I have seen
And you just eyeballed this one.
thousands.
And thousands.
Yeah.
How many triangles have we collectively, obviously we haven't seen all of them.
Yeah.
And yet what you just said is it's true of all triangles that they have interior angles equaling 180 degrees. This is a triangle, therefore it has interior angles equaling 180 degrees. Who has their protractor with them?
Go anywhere without it.
Nobody? This is college. What are you doing without a protractor?
Would a compass
Let
work?
no one. You have a compass?
Yeah.
You're kidding.
Amazing.
Maybe that's what I meant. Maybe that's what I meant.
I mean, this.
Oh, well, that would have helped with my circles.
Oh.
Do you really have? That's cool. But you don't have a protractor? Does anyone have an app on your phone for a protractor? Don't answer that. I guarantee you can get it. If you wanted one, you'll find it. They have it. And let's imagine we were to measure this triangle. Would it come to 180 degrees? No. Because that's a shitty triangle. That's not a very good triangle. It's just not. If you measured it and the protractor was a good one, it wouldn't come to 180 degrees. And even if it was a good one and the protractor demonstrated to us, yeah, 180 degrees, that still wouldn't be sufficient for Plato. Because what is a protractor but a physical thing in this world that's subject to change and has limitations and is therefore not and should not be a condition or a standard for what counts as knowledge. Let's look at these examples here. So I made 3 efforts there. Which one's the best circle? Can you all in the back see? If you want, you can come close. They're pretty good. They're pretty good circles.
I think the first one.
Raise your hand. How many think number 1's the best circle? Oh my gosh, really? How many think number 2 is? You're wrong, because you're outnumbered. Right? What fallacy is that?
Bandwagon.
Bandwagon or appeal to popularity? Why do those who think number 1 is the best think that? Why? Is that a perfect circle?
No.
Just to clear.
It's an oval. Really?
It's not an oval.
It's not an oval?
It's just a line.
How dare you? So it's the neatest one. It's the closest one to a. What do we say? It's a better one. To say that that's a better circle than the others implies what?
The other circles are.
There's multiple types of circles.
No, that's not true. It's not a circle at all. Because it's not. It has to be perfect.
No, it doesn't.
If circles are all the same, how can one be better than the other?
They're not all the same. This one's better. But I think you're all right. You know what? This is too confusing. Those were actually were pretty good efforts on those. Let me just do that and that. Okay, how do we know that one's better than those other 2? Yes?
Um,
Oh,
we
sorry.
know that.
Yeah, I can get her hand first. Go ahead and then I'll get you.
The other 2 circles are good. We know that because they're not the typical shape that we think of.
They're not good. We have to be cautious. Why is this one better? Because the others are bad. Then it just pushes the question, what makes the others bad? And I see where you're going. Let's get your hand and then I'll get your hand.
Yeah, I know with the third circle, there's actually a big gap. It almost looks like more like a spiral than a circle.
How do you know that that's not supposed to be a circle? How do you know that's a
Because-
better one than that one here?
Because a circle is supposed to be completely round on all sides, and they're all supposed to be the same distance apart. And on number 2, there may be some curves that are more rounded than others, and on number 3, there's a big gap between
Yeah,
the
that's
lines.
really
right
poor.
there.
That's the worst one. It's the furthest one from the ideal circle.
I think 1 because it's closest to the definition of a circle. Someone like
Sorry.
Plato made
Do you smell something burning? Is that just me? Sure, it's fine.
Are you paralyzed in your left arm?
Maybe it's
It smells toast.
Oh, no, it's
Okay.
or almonds, is it?
Yeah.
I think the hemlock's finally kicking in. I'm sure it's fine. Just, I'm the only one? That's why you have a legitimate question. I'm sure we're fine. Now it's, let's not dwell on it. Did you smell anything outside? Burning? Is anything burning outside?
No, I don't think so.
Fine. Let me get your hand first, then I'll move on.
It's closest to the definition of a circle. Someone made up along time ago, like Plato.
Okay, it's close to the definition. Very good. The definition is going to be important. Yes.
I was gonna say that it's symmetrical.
It's more symmetrical. And that's relevant too. There's a couple other hands and then we'll see. Go ahead.
We have a priori of what a circle is supposed to look like.
How do we have a priori what a circle is supposed to look like? Where does it come from?
Because we've witnessed multiple circles of things that we have called circles. We've had
Yeah.
millions and millions of circles that we've seen in nature.
Have you ever seen a perfect circle? Not the band.
No,
There's a band
because
called the perfect
you have
a
enough
perfect
data
circle.
to compare two circles. If you have enough data between them, you don't have to have a perfect circle. You can compare circles across each other.
Yes, but if there's not a standard, how can we say one's better than another? Aren't we comparing? Here's Plato's point. Aren't we comparing? When we compare two things and say one's better than another, that presumes we know what a best is. And here's the argument. Since we don't know what the best is, because we can't ever experience a perfect circle, it could not have come from our physical, experiential data. In fact, we don't know of this triangle that equals 180 degrees by measuring it. We know it a priori, right? Mathematicians, geometers don't go around measuring each triangle. Here's another one. We found yet another triangle, and then report back to the mathematic agency another triangle to support our claim that they're all having two angles equal 180 degrees. We know it of all of them, and somebody mentioned definition. Where does the definition come from? Do we define the geometrical shapes and the facts about them, and then see them in the world? Or is the world determined by our linguistic definitions? Do you see this discussion we touched on last time? There was a hand in the back I don't want to forget. No? Did you want to add?
Isn't it kind of like scientific theory where someone has a theory and then they go out and test it over and over again, and it's not 100% true, but every single time someone tests it, it's what happens?
That is going to be what's known as the empiricist approach. Plato's not going to rely on that because it relies on experience. And experience is not going to be sufficient to get us to knowledge. That's a great question, and you'll see that next week we'll look at empiricists who argue that it is experience that gives us knowledge, even though experience might have its limitations. It's the best thing we've got, as scientists today would say. This is the best thing we have, and we have to replicate it. That doesn't mean we're going to get it with 100% certainty. But note the bar of knowledge, the bar for knowledge, for rationalists, bless you, is very high. Did you have a question?
I was going to say, is it more so that they rely on the mathematics because it's more infinite than the real world? It lasts, not that it lasts, but it is not tangible.
What do you mean more infinite? How could something be more infinite?
Well, it...
Like infinite, my son did this the other day. You're at infinite number of times plus one. And I said,
it's not
what the hell does that mean, Milo? He's only 6, so
There's
he likes
no
it.
existence of it. It's not tangible. It
Oh.
doesn't exist. So it's just
That-
always there. It's always...
Well, he wouldn't want to say it doesn't exist. In fact, he's going to do the opposite and say it's more real
It's more
than what our
real.
senses
More
give us.
reasonable or rational than...
And certainly rational, bless you. And we'll see why that is in a second. There's a hand, I think, in the back. Question?
Yeah, so it's rationalism and empiricism, right?
Correct.
So could you equate then a priori and
Posteriori?
yeah, sorry. Could you equate those two to nature and nurture, saying that you kind of like a blank slate, but you know what you know because we can never experience the exact idea of, let's say, shapes or numbers, but that empiricism is more nurture, where your environment is interacting with you, but you can never get there.
Yeah. So in the reading we'll have with Locke, he'll talk about innate ideas, and he doesn't like that idea. He doesn't think that we come like computers pre-programmed with ideas, with knowledge that we can then spit out prior to having experienced anything in the world. And so in that way of dividing nature versus nurture, even Locke probably would admit that there's no strict divide. There's probably a little bit of both, but he's writing before theories of evolution and genetic inheritance and so forth. However, your dichotomy makes sense. Nurture, that's experience, if you want, environment. that affects what you know. The rationalists are saying, well, yes, experience plays a role in our claims to knowledge, but it never is going to be sufficient. It cannot stand as a bar, as a criteria for knowledge. It can only give us opinion. It can only give us belief. Experience is never enough. To rely on our five senses and experiencing the world is like sitting in a cave staring at what? Shadows, and taking the shadows to be reality. The shadows are real, but they're copies of what is real. If we're relying on our senses, we're relying on merely taking in copies, not true reality, he'll say. Yeah?
Couldn't it be knowledge that I am experiencing something? So by using experience, I therefore have the knowledge that I am experiencing something. Right off the bat, you would know you are experiencing something.
No, you could say that's
Through
inaccurate.
experience.
You could potentially say that's inaccurate because your perception might be different from somebody else's.
Well, no, not that I'm perceiving something. Just the act of experiencing. I am experiencing. I know I am experiencing.
Well, to your point, couldn't you, not that you're mistaken about that, but that requires a kind of thinking about your own thinking, or that I doubt infants have. Do you remember being an infant and saying, this experience of desiring a nipple is very odd to me? I don't know if that's, probably infants don't think that way. Maybe they do.
I'm not saying in the infant side or anything. I'm just saying you were saying that we can't use experience to denote specific knowledge.
According to rationalists.
Looking at it from a rationalist view.
That's right.
But right off the bat, that would be a counterpoint that by experiencing, I do know I am experiencing.
But that would then the counter to that would be, you are presuming that you now know things because of experience. And if we take your life back all the way to you being just 2, and before that being just born, or maybe even in the womb, you have experiences. You hear your mother's voice, and that's the first thing you hear, and that's why you have the accent that you do. You get it from your mom, not anywhere else, typically. And we could say, from the rationalist perspective, it sounds very odd that we can just build knowledge from brute experience, as if we start, as Locke will put it, as a blank slate. And then, which is another way of saying, I start at 0. I have no knowledge of anything. So I come into the world and I have my first experience. What's that going to be like? Nobody remembers their first experience. Nobody remembers the moment of being born. Some people claim, Shirley MacLaine says she does. Don't think that's accurate, but that's her. What is that first experience going to be like? Does the entity in question even know that it's having an experience? To know that you're having an experience seems to already have some conceptual capacity. Where do you get the conceptual capacity? Do you build it one at a time? Do I learn a concept one at a time? Notice how weird that would be. Can you learn of the concept of chair without having any other concepts? No, because part of the definition of a chair implies knowing other concepts. So to have one concept be meaningful requires having at least 2 or 3 others, and then it immediately multiplies. With respect to experience, what is it like to have an experience you've never had before? And therefore you cannot connect to any prior understanding, because there are no prior understandings to work from. That means the first experience you're going to have is completely meaningless. How could you go from a completely meaningless experience to a second experience that somehow meaning comes out of? This is the rationalist critique of a pure empiricism that says we build knowledge from experience. The bar is too low, according to rationalists, to say that it is experience for us to come to an adequate understanding of knowledge. Let me ask you this. What are the necessary and sufficient conditions for knowledge? According to Plato, and as mentioned in Rauhut's text. Yeah.
True justified belief.
True justified belief. Those 3 parts have to be there. They are, according to philosophers, up until 1953, roughly, with Edmund Gettier and his Gettier counterexamples, Philosophers since then basically, or up to then, basically thought here are the necessary and jointly sufficient conditions to count as knowledge. You have to have a belief. If you don't believe it, then you don't know it. Even though we sometimes talk that way. You know, I can't believe it's so cloudy out. Or, I can't believe it's not butter. It's written right there. You can believe. Well, I don't mean I don't believe it. But notice we say things like that all the time. We don't mean that. We mean, I'm surprised. You do believe it's cloudy out or foggy or whatever that marine layer. You do believe that. So, to know something first requires belief. Why is that not enough for knowledge? Yep.
You could be wrong,
And why? Why is it a problem? Why is it that you could be wrong?
then it's not knowledge.
If it's wrong, if it's not true, it doesn't count as knowledge. And if belief were the only criteria for something to be known, wouldn't that mean every belief I have in my head is true? I have knowledge now, just by virtue of being in my head. Even if there are contradictory beliefs, and even if you hold a contradictory belief to me. If the only condition is that you hold the belief, then we'd have all sorts of absurdities, right? The earth is flat and also not flat at the same time. Why? Well, because some people believe it's flat and some people believe it's not flat. And beliefs make something knowledge. No, you can't know something that's not justified, that's not also true. So a belief that's false doesn't count as knowledge. Even though people claimed to know the earth was flat, they had the belief that the earth was flat, and they were all wrong. Every one of them who held that belief was wrong. What if their belief was true? Doesn't that count as knowledge? Don't you know something if you have a belief and the belief is true? Why do you need more than that?
Isn't it when you find out your belief is true, you gain knowledge, basically?
Well, why is it not? Oh, but you didn't until after then. Why is having a belief that's true? So remember the WOB, the web of beliefs?
Yeah.
I have a lot of beliefs, and some of them may be true. Why is that not enough? Come up with a counter example where you have a true belief, but we would say intuitively, yeah, but that's not knowledge. What would be an example? Do you have one?
I was just gonna say that almost anything, because truth is relative. So, for example, somebody who thinks they're intelligent could say, "I believe that I'm intelligent, and I am intelligent," and that's the truth. But that's subjective.
And all truths are like that?
So, well, most, I think.
Most. What about the claim, most truths are relative? Is that relative?
Yes.
So, what does that mean? We'll come back to relativism, because that's a tough one. That's one of the things that Socrates is responding to. And he'll say something like that. If the relativist is correct, that all truths are relative, then if you look at it in an extreme version, there are degrees of relativism, as we'll see. But an extreme version of relativism, like an extreme version of skepticism, undermines itself. If relativism is true, then there's no good reason to be a relativist, because it's just, by its own admission, it's just as good or valuable as any other theory. I'll say more about that in a bit. But if it's a true belief, but only a true belief, and it's missing that third condition, as you mentioned, justification, we can imagine that knowledge is not present. And do you have an example? No? You have one?
Can you give an example?
Oh, I was asking everyone else, but okay. I was misplacing the burden, perhaps. So here's an example. Let's imagine we're out at the horse races betting. Can you bet on the horses here? Well, let's just say you can. And I tell you to bet on this horse, whatever the horse's name is. What's a stupid horse name that they have in racing? Skipper?
Seabiscuit.
Lucky? Seabiscuit? Seabiscuit. I remember that. So Seabiscuit, I say, look, you should bet on this horse Seabiscuit. And you say, why? Because I'm betting all of my money. You should bet all of your money, because Seabiscuit's going to win. And let's imagine, when the person says that, when I say that, it's before the race. But it turns out the belief that Seabiscuit's going to win is true. I have the belief that Seabiscuit's going to win, and it is true that Seabiscuit wins the race. But you don't know that yet. What would count? What would you ask for of me that would count as justification, there it is, that you would put all of your money on Seabiscuit? What would you ask me? What would count for you? What would qualify
as justification?
I guess some evidence or like mathematical proof that he's won a lot.
Mathematical proof.
I don't know.
A deductive argument? And
Yeah, I guess all I'm hearing is that like maybe Plato doesn't believe it's knowledge until it's been proven kind of like mathematically.
yes, deductively a priori. If it's statistics, however, which is a branch of mathematics, he has a problem with that. Because statistics will only tell us, look, Seabiscuit has won, let's say, 100% of all of, is it he or she? Doesn't matter. All of its races. And this is a new race. The other horses have not won all of their races. Therefore, Seabiscuit necessarily is going to win. Just because Seabiscuit has won. I mean, I thought the Eagles were going to lose last night. I thought Tom Brady, because he's like a god, was going to win. Turns out he gets sacked at a unexpected time, and that lost the game. Anyone watch the game? I watched the fourth quarter. I think four times. Do you know why I watched it 4 times? Because in football, they replay every damn scene 3 or 4 times immediately after it happens. And it just struck me. Is that weird? Every single play. There's not a single play in that whole game that did not get replayed, no matter how mundane it was. The halfback ran 1 yard, and they replay it. There he is, he got tackled. We see it twice. We watch football. Anyway, I don't know why that's surprising to me, but I haven't watched football for years, and I realized I just saw this quarter 4 times. So think about it next time you watch football. So the justification is, maybe it's mathematical, but would you put all of your money on a horse just because you're relying upon prior statistics? Remember, the horse race hasn't happened yet.
If it's gonna win, I guess that's.
Yeah, we don't have certainty,
Yeah.
and there's a high bar of knowledge. Is that too high? What else would you ask? Let's say if I truly knew, that wouldn't satisfy, just mere statistics. Maybe something else is needed.
What are the other horses like?
What are the other horses like? Yeah, and I can get really good justification. You want to put all your money on Seabiscuit. Why? Because I drugged all the other horses. And in fact, they're all dead. I've killed every horse. And Seabiscuit, I also gave him some steroids just to be sure. Actually, no, that may kill that horse too. Seabiscuit's perfectly normal, perfectly fine, but all the other horses are dead. Ha! Probably Seabiscuit's going to win. Then you might put your money down, right? Although, does it necessitate it? Could you imagine a scenario in which Seabiscuit runs out and realizes there's no other horses? And then has a heart attack or whatever, freaking out. So all the horses are dead. Where does that get you? It's a terrible thought experiment. In any case, the bar is extremely high for Plato with respect to what counts as knowledge. So what's the justification? Bless you. For empiricists, experience will provide that justification. What kind of experience we'll talk about. For rationalists, it's reason. It's our mind. Or for Plato, it is our mind connecting or reconnecting with what he calls the forms. A very complex and difficult concept that seems fundamental to his metaphysics, theories of what exists, and his epistemology, his theories of knowledge. And to give you a sense of that, I'm going to break down a very broad overview of Plato's reasoning. This is not Plato directly. This is trying to put Plato into standard logical form, where we get a sense of why he's arguing the way that he does. And in this context, Plato is seen as a dualist, in the sense that there are, if you want, 2 realms. And he looks at the philosophy of a guy named Heraclitus, who was a philosopher before him, who argued that everything in the physical world is constantly in flux. Heraclitus says this. Plato agrees. You can never step into the same river twice, Heraclitus famously said. It's constantly different waters flowing past. You are constantly changing. Everything in the physical world is subject to change. Let's assume that's true for the sake of argument. And by the way, it's easy to assume that's true because I think it is. Unless you can come up with a counter in which, nope, here's something physical that doesn't change. Yes?
You sit in the same chair more than twice.
I'm sorry?
Will that work?
What was it? I didn't hear.
The chair doesn't change.
Which chair? Any chair?
That chair.
That chair is probably 30 years old.
But it's the same.
I'll give it 30 years. Be liberal. Not politically liberal, just why that's political. tree hugger. How dare you come up with that definition of chair? It didn't exist 30 years ago. And in 20 years, it's probably not going to be here. So it will have undergone change. That's all he means. That chair hasn't always been. It's subject to change. And it's changing right now at the molecular level. It's changing all the time.
Well, that's the key word is time. What if time is just a human concept? What if there is no actual time? People assume that linear time is linear, and if you're looking at change, change is based on time.
Then it's changing.
Therefore, you can't quite say, unless time is linear, there is no such thing as change.
So this is a view of not Heraclitus, but the alternative view, the other end of the spectrum, a guy named Parmenides, who says that change doesn't happen. It's an illusion. Everything is one. Nothing moves, nothing changes. All is mind. It's a confusion of our senses to say otherwise. And that's a very complex and confusing argument. We're not going to get into that particularly. Aristotle has a lot to say about change in time. But even if humans didn't exist, we might ask, 14 billion years ago, there was a Big Bang, and the universe was created. That still underwent changes such that stars were formed, regardless of human beings.
That's just the human interpretation of it.
Correct.
What if that wasn't the case? What if everything is at once? I think if time is non-linear, that's still assuming...
Time nonlinear could mean it's circular, which doesn't mean there's no time. It just means it's repeating.
Well, that would mean time would flow in a direction. What if time is just a variable, such as motion is a variable?
Then we define change based on motion, and would still be another variable that we're relying upon, and we'd still say there's change. Now but notice he's not disagreeing with what you're saying because he's a dualist. Half of the notion is correct. He agrees with Heraclitus. Everything's in constant change, and he agrees with Heraclitus, at least his interpretation of Heraclitus. If everything is changing, then there's nothing that could be known, because the thing that you claim to know has become something other than what it was. And you too, the knower, are also changing. The object that is known and the knower are both constantly changing. And so the relationship is one is such that knowledge becomes impossible. That's a bit more controversial than the first claim. Not everyone's going to accept just because something changes makes it unknowable. But for the sake of argument, let's assume it's true, and then we'll see further.
But assuming that our body is like a physical being and our soul, we continue to live on, and that's our mind, and everything's created from that. If you know it, does that not live on even if you have changed physically and the thing has changed, it still lives in your mind, and if you believe that true, justified belief, how does that not continue to live on?
That's where we get number 3. We do have knowledge. But I'll say more in a moment. Yes?
Does Plato believe it's knowledge? Because like sometimes it can be a true justified belief, but then that true justified belief changes into a different belief that can also be true and justified. Is it knowledge if it somehow changes?
That's a really good question, and it's hard to answer because it's unclear what Plato counts as, to jump a little bit ahead here, the forms. To be genuine knowledge for Plato, it requires access to an unchanging realm. And to know something means to have it fixed, stable, unchanging. Once it's susceptible to change, we're no longer in the realm of knowledge. It's appearance, it's opinion, it's whim. I think that's how, in very, very general terms, he would describe that. Yeah.
We have 8 minutes left.
What's that?
We have 8 minutes left.
Who wants to stay longer today? Why I even asked. Oh, what's the conclusion? Let me just finish this up. Thank you. I'll get those quizzes back. What's the conclusion here? If those are true, and we do know certain things, like we know about triangles, we know about circles. Oh, damn it! How did that happen? Unintentional. Well, there is a conclusion. Do you see? I accidentally hit enter there. Shoot. So if 1 is 2, if 2 is true, and if it's true that we do have certain knowledge, that's premise 3, it must be that certain knowledge can't come from this physical world. We know that that's a better circle than the other 2, not because of any physical experiences of a perfect circle, because there's no such thing. We know it because of prior acquaintance with the forms. There is a form for perfect circularity. There's a form for perfect deskhood. There's a form for justice, for piety, for the good, and so on. Those are the most important ones. And whether or not there are forms for cups, for books, for individual souls, we leave that up to the Platonists, philosophers who study Plato. That's a huge debate, and even when Plato was writing, it was unclear exactly what he thought about that. But that goes to your other question. What about certain claims to know about directions to a particular place? Don't I know that in some sense? It doesn't require access to an unchanging realm of forms? That's a hugely debated topic. All right, so let me stop there.